Okay, where we left off, a British naval surveying ship, Her Majesty's ship Beagle, had spent 3 years exploring South America, making a lot of discoveries that I just don't have time to get into, with the naturalist on board, Charles Darwin, collecting animals, plants, minerals, fossils, and trying to understand what he was seeing. And when we left off, um, he was hanging out in the Galapagos Islands, which had so many species that were similar to species on the South American mainland. Now, the South American mainland is 600 miles across open ocean, but the life on the Galapagos was similar to the mainland, but at the same time, not identical. It was unique to the islands. And what's more, different species were adapted as if they'd been shaped for different lifestyles. So we have 14 species of birds that are all finches. They're all perching, seed-eating birds, but some have small beaks and specialize on tiny seeds, and some have big beaks like a parrot and crack big seeds. Some have tweezer-like beaks and eat cactus seeds and fruits. Some have really sharp beaks and peck larger birds in the butt and drink their blood. This is kind of weird. So the Beagle sails back. They reach England on October 2nd, 1836. Darwin lived in London for a while, but eventually married and moved to a house in what used to be the country. It's now a suburb called Down House. This is now maintained as a museum, and this is where he lived from 1842 until he died in 1882. He came down with some kind of chronic illness. We're not really sure what it was. It may have been a chronic disease he acquired in the tropics. It may have been something hereditary. We're not really sure. So he never got to leave England again and spent whole days just completely incapacitated, whole days when he could hardly get up off the sofa. Fortunately, he came from a pretty wealthy family, so he was able to live off investments and things like that. He never had to work. And he did manage to publish 20 books in his lifetime. So even though he did not have to hold down a job because of his independent wealth, he certainly wasn't lazy. And when he got back, he had his hands full writing up findings and discoveries that the expedition had made. Those would eventually get published. But he had some time to think about this weird possibility that maybe, just maybe, crazy thought, biological species weren't fixed. They could somehow change over time, not over a single generation, but over many. If that were true, if living species could shift what they looked like over long periods of time from one generation to the next, it would seem to explain a lot of things that Darwin had observed and that a lot of other scientists had observed as well. One is what we now call the field of biogeography. Here's those finches again. The Galapagos are relatively young. They have not been around for nearly as long as the mainland of South America. That's the nearest large land area to them. They have so many species that are unique only to the Galapagos, sometimes unique to specific islands in the Galapagos. Yeah, there are species that are found only on one or just a couple of islands in the Galapagos. And yet, they're unique to the Galapagos, but similar to the mainland. Why do we get that pattern? Why should there be 14 species of finch that are unique to the Galapagos, but at the same time look close to South American finches? How did they get there? Why 14? Why are there 14 varieties of giant land tortoise and 3 or 4 species of mockingbird, and about 10 species of prickly pear cactus that are unique to the Galapagos. How'd they get there? Why should they be different? Here's another one that Darwin himself did not come up with. This was worked out by a British scientist named Robert Owen. In the center, you see the bones of a human hand. That's a seal flipper on the right and a bat wing on the left, and they do very different things. Bat wings fly, seal flippers swim, human hands play the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto. Well, some do. Mine never did. But if you look carefully, you can match them up bone for bone. They've all got 10 carpal bones making up the lower part of the hand. Right there. Okay, not right there. Right there. There they are in the human. There they are in the seal. I promise you they're there in the bat. They've all got 5 metacarpal bones. That's these. There and there and there. And then they've all got digits. They've all got phalanges, 3 bones in most of your fingers and 2 in your thumb. Here's the same pattern in the seal flipper, 3 bones in most of the fingers, right? Like those, and 2 in the thumb. And there's the corresponding bones in the human, and there are the corresponding bones in the bat. It's the same pattern, which raises the question, why? Why would a bat wing, a human hand, a seal flipper, a dog leg, a cat paw, allowing for the fact that some bones have gone missing, even a cow's hoof or a sheep's leg, or a whale flipper, as different as the things that they do, why should they be built of the same fundamental arrangement of bones? Why could you pair up, the bones of the human hand and the bones of the seal flipper, bone for bone? Wonder why. Some other scientists at the time, especially a guy named Carl von Baer, had pointed out that if you looked at embryos, developing stages of an organism still inside the egg or still inside the uterus, the embryos look very much alike even when the adults were completely different. So there's a turtle embryo on the left and a chicken embryo on the right. And if you look at them, this is roughly 72 hours after fertilization, you can hardly tell them apart. They both have this C shape. They both got developing eyes. They've both got these little clefts in the throat. There, and there. There, and there. They're called the pharyngeal clefts. They've both got paddle-like flippers. They've both got blocks of muscle tissue running down the spine called somites. Those and those. And it's only if you open fertile chicken or turtle eggs a bit later than that that you see the turtle is now starting to develop a shell and the chicken isn't. And of course, adults don't look anything like each other. Why should turtles and chickens, which are so different as adults, come from embryos that are so similar you can hardly tell them apart? One I can vouch for myself, why should this chicken embryo be remarkably hard to distinguish from a pig embryo? Or for that matter, you didn't look all that different at a particular stage in your development. Why is the adult so different from a chicken when the embryos are so similar? Why should those similarities even exist? Why don't turtles always look like turtles? We've already established that you can tell time using fossils. And if you go back in Earth history, the farther back you go, the less familiar the fossils look. So I think I mentioned that by 1830, when Darwin was still in college, just about everybody accepted that the life on Earth had gone through changes over time. And the Earth was, nobody knew exactly, but pretty darn old. Darwin actually wrote in a letter about one of his professors, a guy named Adam Sedgwick, who was teaching geology. Darwin said, "What a capital hand is Sedgwick for drawing huge checks upon the bank of time." In other words, Sedgwick was perfectly happy with the idea that the Earth might be many millions of years old. And the fossils show that life in the past is not the same as it is today. One of the discoveries that Darwin made was some fossils in South America that seemed to blend features of what we'd now call very separate biological groups. Here's one that was actually found a few years after Darwin published his thinking. It's from a quarry in Germany. It's called Archaeopteryx lithographica. It's got hands with claws on them, three-fingered clawed hands, just like a raptor, a velociraptor. You can't see it in this picture, but there are teeth. There's teeth here, and claws on the hands, and a long bony tail. And you can't see them on this fossil, but there are some others that show it had ribs in the belly, and the breastbone is flat. And basically what this thing would look like if we put all of the bones together as they were in life is it would look like a small raptor dinosaur with maybe kind of unusually long fingers. Not that different from Velociraptor, which I know you know because you've all seen Jurassic Park. And yet, the thing is so well preserved that it's got feathers. We know that it does. It had, in fact, it had wings. So there's a wing, there's a wing, there's feathers on the tail. This thing probably could fly. It may not have been that good at it, but it was probably able to fly. So is this thing a dinosaur or is it a bird? Why do we have this mix of features, things that are birdy, like feathers and wings, and things that aren't, like teeth and a long bony tail? If you've ever seen a plucked chicken, you'd know that birds have tails made out of feathers, but they don't have bones in them. They just have that little nub right above the hole where you put in the stuffing. They don't have long bony tails like this. That's a dinosaur feature. So how do we get things like this? Why? Last thing I'll mention for our, I'm told my connection was unstable there for a minute, but the last thing I'll mention for my purposes is what we call vestigial structures. If you've ever watched a cow or a horse, you will have noticed that they can move their ears. Horses will flick their ears to get flies out of them, or sometimes to indicate their emotional state. Your cats and your dogs do the same thing. You've all seen dogs pricking up their ears, or cats laying their ears back just before they start biting at you and drawing blood. Sorry, I know this very well. We've managed to accumulate 6 cats in this house. So all mammals, as far as I know, well, except for the Okay, sorry about dropping out like that. I am back. Good to see that you are mostly still here. You check the chat real quick, like, okay. All right, so let's pick it up where we left off and go back to share. Can everybody see that? Somebody unmute and tell me if you can see this or not.
I can't see anything yet.
Okay, hang on. All right. Sorry about the technical glitch. Here we go. Looks like we're still actually recording. Okay, let's start that share again then. Okay, there we are. There's the share. And okay, we're already we should still be recording. There we go. Let's get that out of here. Okay. Cows, horses, dogs, cats, they're all capable of wiggling their ears. And they have muscles that attach to their ears that let them do it. All right, checking the chat here to make sure I haven't missed anything. Okay. You've got ears as well, and you've got muscles that wiggle your ears. That's them. They're right there. But here's the thing. Most people never learn how to use them. Most people never learn how to wiggle their ears. In a typical class this size, there might be one or two people who have the ability to wiggle their ears. What's more, ear wiggling makes no difference, as far as I've ever been able to tell, in survival. It's about the most useless skill you can have. I've never heard of anybody who was able to save his or her life by wiggling their ears. I've never heard of anybody who was able to have lots of babies because of that person's unique ability to wiggle their ears. It really doesn't do much good. So why do you have these muscles that most people never even learn to use? What are they doing there in the first place? You could lose these and probably not even notice. So what are these doing there? That's what we call a vestigial structure. So Darwin puts all of this together, and he thinks he's got the idea by a couple of years after the end of the Beagle voyage. We know a lot about what he was thinking because his notebooks and most of the letters written to and from him have actually survived. So we know what the man was thinking on a day-to-day basis. And as he wrote, I determined to collect every sort of fact which could bear any way on what our species. I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not immutable, meaning species are not unchanging. As he put it, it is like confessing a murder. Okay, checking chat, let's go. The simplest way to explain everything that he'd seen and everything that he'd learned, including a lot of discoveries that he himself didn't make, was this idea that the life on Earth must have changed over time. And what's more, the change is what we would call genetic change. Living things look like each other because they are descended from common ancestors. And they share features because they're descended from common ancestors. Please mute. But living things differ from each other because they've changed over many generations. This is a diagram from one of his early notebooks. At the root of this tree diagram, you have an ancestral species, some type of living thing. And over time, that species of living thing divides in two, which divide into more and give rise to four different descendant living species, plus a bunch of extinct ones that are represented here by these dead-end branches. Okay, so the idea is basically change over time. We now call this the idea of evolution, or the dreaded E word, as we say in Arkansas. And one of the things that Darwin gets credit for is he gathered more evidence from more areas of science that evolution had happened. Even though he was an invalid for much of his life, he still was able to communicate with scientists all over the world, wrote lots of letters, read articles and books as they came out. and was able to gather more information that evolution had happened. And he proposed a mechanism for what was causing this change. He'd been reading a book by a scholar named Thomas Malthus, one of the founders of sociology, called On the Principle of Population. Malthus argued that in any country, the human population would always, if left unchecked, outgrow its own food supply. That you can increase the amount of food that a country can produce by cultivating more land, developing better crops, developing better techniques and better fertilizers and things like that. But no matter how much you did it, a population of people had the capacity over just a few generations to outgrow that supply. And so you would always be in a state where there wasn't quite enough to go around. Darwin later wrote that, as he put it, under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The results of this would be the formation of a new species. So how does this work? Populations of living things are capable of increasing exponentially without limit. What we mean by exponential growth is that there is a fixed time interval over which the population will double. If you start with 2 bunny rabbits, assuming they are opposite sexes, over a certain length of time, you'll get 4. And then over the same length of time, you'll get 8. And over the same length of time, you'll get 16, and then 32, 64, 128, 256. The population doubles over a fixed interval. That's exponential growth. They're capable of doing that, but in nature, we don't generally see that. Populations tend to stay roughly constant. They might zig, they might zag, they might go up a bit, they might go down a bit, but we don't see exponential growth indefinitely. We can't, and I'll show you why in just a minute. The conclusion is that not all of the offspring that a population can produce can survive. And here's an example. There's a couple of common fruit flies, the sort of thing that you might get in your kitchen if you leave bananas out for too long. And the life cycle from egg to sexually mature adult under ideal conditions takes about 7 days. Somebody did the math and worked out that if you started with 1 pair of flies and you gave them all the right food and all of the water that they needed and just the right temperature, you gave them the best possible conditions for fruit flies to live, you let that pair of fruit flies breed, and they had all the babies they could, and then you fed their offspring and gave them the right conditions, and you let them breed, and you kept on going. In 1 year, you would have a ball of fruit flies the size of the earth. I love you, sweetie. Have a good day. All right. My wife is heading out. All right. Have a good day.
See you in a while.
Okay. Right. Just checking the chat. And clearly this cannot happen in the real world. There have never been that many fruit flies on Earth, as you can tell by the fact that the Earth has not been replaced with a ball of nothing but fruit flies. Something has to act to keep those populations down. Sometimes it's people spraying pesticide. Sometimes it might be disease. Fruit flies can get sick. Sometimes it might be predators, too many fruit flies, and maybe the spiders move in and start catching them and eating them. It could be starvation. Maybe there's not enough food to go around for all of them. Something is going to happen to keep the fruit fly population from becoming as large as the entire Earth. In fact, in nature, probably a lot of things would have this effect. And that sets up a metaphorical thing called the struggle for existence. Now, Darwin's ideas get associated a lot with struggle, and people tend to think of it as, survival of the meanest, savage lions ruthlessly hunting down the weak and the old gazelles on the Serengeti plain, or ferocious great white sharks savagely hunting down the weak and the sick in the sea lion population, or whatever Animal Planet is doing this week. There's a lot of nature documentaries that give that impression. The struggle is real, but don't interpret it as a literal struggle. The fruit flies are not necessarily beating each other up. You can have this going on in a forest. There's only so much sunlight per square meter available, and some plants might tend to shade out other plants. That doesn't mean that the trees are punching each other. It's not like we have Ents or anything like that. It's not like Treebeard is beating up on poison ivy, or that'd be an interesting combo. That's not what's happening. It just refers to the fact that there is, oh boy, I am being told that the fire alarm is going off in the library. Those of you in the library, get out of here and we'll pick this up. Just pick up the recording. Okay, sorry about that. If you're in the library, get out. Don't listen to this. There's a fire. Okay, I hope it doesn't work out like the fire at the Arkansas Tech Library. You heard about the fire they had? Both books were destroyed. Neither one had been colored in yet. It was terrible. Right. Okay, somebody type lol. Thank you. Okay. Second, organisms, living things in the same population vary among themselves. They're not all identical. You can see this in your own classrooms. You are different from everybody else, unless you happen to be an identical twin. And even then, they're not 100% absolute clones. And you'd see this in any other population. All of the cats in my house are different. All of the clover plants growing outside the library that students are no doubt stepping on as they try to get out because there's a fire alarm. All of those are different from each other. It might not be obvious unless you really take the time to look, but you can find differences like that in any population. Organisms vary among themselves. What's more, that variation is at least in part heritable. It can be passed on from one generation to the next. Living things tend to resemble their parents and show features that their parents have. You look more like your biological parents than you would look like two people selected at random off the street. Our cats look more like their parents than they would like random cats picked up out of the shelter. What you looking for, sweetie? Sorry. You found it?
Sure.
All right. Okay.
Sorry, just forgot something.
Quite all right, love. Now, you don't have to understand why this is the case. We'll be getting into why this happens. And you don't have to understand why yet. We'll talk about that, but it's something that anybody can observe, that individuals vary in populations. Every human on the campus looks a little different. Every surf clam on the Gulf Coast of Florida, these things I used to pick up by the handful as a kid, each one of them is different. Any other species that you care to name varies, and that variation is inherited. Offspring show their parents' traits. Okay, part one, part two. Here's part three. Some individuals vary in ways that increase the chances that they will not just survive, but more importantly, that they'll survive long enough to reproduce. Others vary in ways that decrease those chances. If we had a forest full of bunny rabbits and we introduced a family of hungry wolves, well, some of those bunny rabbits, because bunny rabbits vary, some of those rabbits would, let's say, maybe have slightly longer legs or faster muscles, and they would have a better chance to outrun the wolves and live long enough to find other bunny rabbits and make babies. Others of those rabbits would just happen to have maybe less efficient muscles or shorter legs or something like that, and they would have a greater chance of getting eaten before they got to reproduce. Of course, it could be other things. Some of those rabbits might have fur colors that happen to blend in with the environment just a bit better, so the wolves don't see them. Others might have coat colors that make them stick out and make them very visible. Some of those rabbits might just happen to be smarter and be able to hide from the wolves. Others might be dumb and be going, oh, wow, dude, wolf. Hey, Mr. Wolf. Hey, how's it going? You know, there's lots of ways this could play out. But some of those rabbits will vary in ways that increase the odds that they'll survive. Others vary in ways that decrease those odds. And individuals that vary in ways that improve their chances of reproducing are going to make more offspring like themselves. The rabbits that are fast will tend to have, okay, yeah, I'm told you guys had the fire alarm pulled on you. Whatever you missed, just pick it up on the, you can pick it up from the YouTube video. Sorry that happened. Where was I? Okay, rabbits that are fast, they're likelier to survive, and that means they've got a chance at producing offspring that are also fast because offspring resemble their parents. Rabbits that are slow are much less likely to have babies. Rabbits that blend in are much more likely to have babies than rabbits that stick out. Rabbits that are smart enough to get the heck away from wolves are likelier to have babies than rabbits that are like, hey, Mr. Wolf, how's it going? The result is that population of rabbits in the forest is going to change what it looks like over time. From one generation to the next generation, you would expect to see rabbits getting born that are faster, maybe longer legged, or maybe more muscular. Or you might expect to see rabbits born that are better camouflaged, or maybe rabbits, you know, for all I know, maybe rabbits that are big enough that they can beat up wolves and get away with it. There's a lot of ways it could play out, but all of these result in change over time. That's the mechanism of evolution by natural selection. Just so we're clear, this happens from over multiple generations. This is not like Pokemon. I know they call it evolution when your Pichu becomes a Pikachu, which evolves into Raichu, or when your, what is it, your Charmander becomes your Charizard, becomes your barbecue dragon. I can't, my kid knows this a lot better than I do. But the changes that something like a Pokemon would undergo just in its lifetime, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about how from one generation to the next, we get change. And it happens over multi-generation timescales. And to show how this works, Darwin, you know, he lived in a nice house that had room for this. So he spent 10 years raising fancy pigeons and learning a lot about pigeon breeding, communicating with pigeon breeders, and working out how they did what they do. The pigeons that you're likeliest to have seen are called the rock pigeon. They're basically feral pigeons. They're native to Central Asia, but they've been introduced around the world. And you may not know this, but there are people that breed pigeons, and they've developed a frighteningly large number of pigeon breeds. This is from an illustration from Darwin's time. And you've got things like, you've got the fantail, which sticks its breast out and has this big peacock fan of feathers. You've got, let me see, that's a barb pigeon with the rings of naked skin around its eyes. The thing with the beak you almost can't see is a short-faced English tumbler. I think that's a nun pigeon right there because it's got this hood of reversed feathers that looks like a nun's habit, sort of, maybe, if you're on drugs. And there's lots of them. And there are hundreds of different pigeon varieties. And we know that they all came from this. This is the wild rock pigeon. This is the one that you would see. There's usually a flock of them down by the railroad tracks in Conway. You've seen pigeons like this in parks. They're just pretty much all over. And if you look at a flock of pigeons, you'll see that they vary. And since at least the ancient Egyptians' time, Darwin actually found this out and learned about the history. So for at least the past 4,000 years, people have been keeping pigeons at home, picking out individuals that have traits that they like, traits that they think are useful or beautiful. Pigeons that have traits that they don't like end up on the grill. You let the pigeons that have traits that you like breed, repeat for many generations, and you go from black fantail, and you get, I'm not even sure what the one below here is called, but you can see how incredibly different these two birds are. And yet they are both descended from wild rock pigeons. People have created these fancy breeds of pigeon just by picking out individuals that have traits that they liked, prettier tails or longer necks or whatever it is, and letting those breed. And some of these get really weird. On the left, the Bacara trumpeter, the head is almost completely buried in big fans of feathers, and it's got huge bunches of feathers on its feet. And I actually know somebody who used to raise fancy pigeons, and according to him, they're also different in intelligence. The Bacara trumpeter is apparently the stupidest animal on Earth. That's basically a zucchini covered in feathers. On the right, the Scandaroon, very different build, very different feathers, and look at that weird hooked beak. Darwin pointed out that if you could find a scientist who didn't already know, and you showed him birds like these two and asked them if they were the same species, he'd probably say no. These birds are different from each other in almost any feature you care to name. There's not just differences in the length and the color of the feathers. They extend to the skeleton. Up at the top left, that's what a wild pigeon looks like. Compare that with the English short-faced tumbler at the top right, and then below the Bagadotan carrier, you can see the shape of the beak. The shapes of the beaks are different. Even the shapes and proportions of the skull can be different from each other. And it's even been possible to modify behavior patterns in domestic pigeons. Homing pigeons, shown on the left, people race these birds. You can take a homing pigeon and you can drive it away as far as 1,100 miles and have it fly back, and it will navigate its way back to its own roost, back to its own home, flying at an average of 50 miles an hour. These are the pigeons that used to be used to carry messages in World War I, and I think in the Civil War as well. If you've ever heard of carrier pigeons, this is what they look like. Tumbler pigeons in the center, those aren't quite as good at flying, but they do have this trick of doing backflips in midair. They'll just fly, fly, flap, 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 flip, and keep on going. Parlor roller pigeons, the ones on the right. They can't fly at all, but they turn somersaults on the ground. I have actually seen footage of people who own parlor roller pigeons taking them out and competing in rolling them on the grass. It's like bocce ball played with pigeons. And the pigeons will just flap their wings and just roll, 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 roll. People compete to see whose pigeon rolls the farthest. Because I guess some people have no other hobbies or something, but it's something people seem to like. So we can modify intelligence. Homing pigeons are pretty smart, and Baccara trumpeters are apparently really dumb. Behavior patterns have been modified, and all of this is through artificial selection. People pick out the pigeons that have traits that they like. Those are the ones that get to breed. Pigeons that don't have traits that they like probably end up fricasseed. Repeat that over many generations, and you get crazy varieties of pigeon. And one of Darwin's points is that these varieties can become so different from each other that they are more different than wild species are different from each other. So on the left, there is a wild pigeon, Columbia livia. On the right, that's a pink-necked fruit dove from Indonesia. And you can tell it's pretty similar to the wild pigeon. The color is, of course, different. The fruit dove has this beautiful pink head. But other than that, they're about the same size. The beak shape and size is about the same. They're about the same build, the same length of the tail. You can tell they are pretty close to each other. So which are more different, those two or the yellow Brunner pouter, which has the ability to inflate its upper digestive tract and walk around looking like its neck is blowing a bubble, compared with the Ackerman tumbler, which does backflips and has feather crests on its head. If you didn't already know that these were both varieties of pigeon, I will bet you would classify these two as separate species. They're different in just about every way you can think of. And if artificial selection can do this in just a few decades, what could natural selection do given millions of years? A few more case studies. When I give you a case study, by the way, you don't have to memorize the details of the study. What I'm going to ask you on the exam is not, what's the difference between a Brunner pouter pigeon and an Ackerman tumbler pigeon? What I might do is ask you something about a completely different species that's also a good example of artificial selection. So here's one. A couple in Southern California in 1981 took in a stray cat, and this is she. They named her Shulamith, by the way. And she had a feature that nobody had ever seen before. She had curly ears. And the Rugas thought this was adorable. So they didn't have Shulamith spayed. They bred her to 3 different toms. So they got 3 different litters of kittens from 3 different fathers. And they let the kittens grow up. They picked the kittens that had the cutest curly ears, and they bred them. And they started giving these cats to other breeders who bred them, and in every generation picked out the cats that had the curliest ears. The cats that didn't have curly ears, not all of them did. The cats that didn't were spayed or neutered and kept as pets and hopefully well treated. But the cats that did have curly ears were saved and allowed to breed. And over the past 40 years, cat breeders have developed a new breed of cat called the American Curl, which always makes me want to sing that Tom Petty song. Well, she was an American Curl, raised on promises. What do you think? Never mind. Don't tell me what you think. And cat breeders continue to do this. In every generation, cats that don't have the curly ears, well, they're probably adopted out as pets. So thank you, Carly. Very kind, very kind. Cats that do have the curly ears get saved for breeding, and the breed continues to be developed. So if you have a few $1,000 to drop on a purebred cat, you too can have your own American curl cat, if you're into that. If you want a longer example, this is called Brassica oleracea. It's a nasty tasting little weed that lives in rotten soil. You'd think it was a totally useless plant. You can eat the leaves. They just taste kind of yucky, but if you're starving, it'll do. Probably about the time of the Romans, people in Northern Europe started planting these deliberately and picking out individuals that had traits they liked. Plants that had big leaves or better taste or other bigger edible parts were allowed to produce seed and be planted the next year. Plants that didn't have a better taste, or my voice is ill-suited for songs sung by women. Tom Petty was a dude, man. Or are you still mad about the way I sang Evanescence? Yeah. All right, thanks for the tip. Okay, plants that had poor tasting leaves or that were small or that were, stunted, those ended up in the soup. Plants that had big leaves or better tasting ones, those were allowed to leave seed for the next generation. Wash, rinse, and repeat over many generations, and our weedy little Brassica oleracea is now broccoli and cauliflower and kohlrabi. I don't know if you know this one. It's a relative of cabbage that has big swollen stems. Or Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are basically the stems of this plant with lots and lots of buds on them. They're all descended from wild cabbage. So are collard greens. So, of course, is cultivated cabbage. The cabbage with the big heads on it. And for thousands of years, farmers have kept seeds from their biggest plants and their tastiest plants and gotten rid of the ones that aren't any good. And the result has been new varieties that are so different that, you probably, just looking at what you see in the supermarket, I'm willing to bet you would not assume that cauliflower and kohlrabi were the same species of plant. But in fact, they are, and they're all descended from this. Or my favorite, teosinte. This is a wild grass native to central Mexico, and you'd have to be desperate to eat it. There is nutrition in the seeds, but they're tough and they're encased in a seed coat that has to be shucked by hand. So they're not that much fun. You'd have to be pretty desperate to start eating teosinte. But people who observe animals and plants would have learned pretty quickly, because it's hard to miss, that if you plant seeds, you get grown-up plants. And if you plant seeds from large plants, you tend to get a new generation of large plants, and so on. They would have noticed very early on that, parents produce offspring that are like themselves. So at some point, 10,000 years ago, these early Native Americans must have started planting seeds from the plants that had the biggest and most digestible seeds. Teosinte plants that didn't have big, tasty seeds might have gotten uprooted. Teosinte plants that did have large and tasty seeds, well, you're going to save some of those seeds for the next generation, repeat this over 10,000 years, and the end result is corn. There's domesticated corn below compared with the seed head of wild teosinte. And not just corn, but over 300 varieties of corn. varieties for fresh eating, sweet corn. Those are different from the corn that's used to make cornmeal. Those are different from the corn that's cultivated as cattle feed. And all of those are different from popcorn. And all of those are different from the ornamental corn that is perfectly edible, but that's usually these days grown as decorations for, your Thanksgiving table. There's a huge number of varieties of domesticated corn, and they all came from teosinte. And we can even find the remains of corn kernels in archaeological digs and trace how this process happened. We've got a fossil record, as it were, of domesticated corn over the past 10,000 years. We know pretty well what people were growing. Just for fun, this is a wild plant called Capsicum annuum, known as the chiltepin. It's a bush with pretty red berries, native to the border region between the United States and Mexico. Now, birds can eat chiltepin berries without any difficulty, but if you pop one of these into your mouth, you are struck by an agonizing burning sensation. So roughly 10,000 odd years ago, a couple of people found a chiltepin, and they probably dared each other to eat the berries. And so, one of them, popped a berry in his mouth, and after 30 minutes of agonized screaming, said, "Hey, that wasn't bad. Let's try another one." I'm guessing alcohol was involved in some way. But people started planting chiltepin seeds, and they started picking out chiltepines that were larger or had larger berries or better tasting berries or berries that didn't burn quite so badly, and so on, picking out varieties of the chiltepin that they liked and probably uprooting chiltepin plants that they didn't like. And after several thousand years, we have most of the varieties of pepper that you know. Habaneros are from a different ancestral species, and so are South American peppers like ají peppers. But most of the ones that you'd see in the supermarket are all descended from those chiltepines, which, by the way, are still cultivated. They are affectionately known as gringo killers because they're very hot. One small handful in your chili, and you cranked it up to like 3 alarm. But descended from the chiltepin and traceable by digging up, archaeological remains, is everything from bell peppers at the upper left to chiles poblanos at the upper right. Those are, if you get stuffed peppers at a Mexican restaurant, that's what they will be. Cayenne peppers used to make, red pepper flakes. Ground red pepper is ground up cayenne peppers, and they look like that. Aurora peppers, which are mostly grown to be pretty, although they taste pretty nice too. And there's hundreds more varieties of pepper, and they all ultimately come from the chiltepin. They all started here. Okay, what we've been talking about is artificial selection. And in artificial selection, individuals vary, and humans pick out the individuals that vary in ways that they like. The best tasting peppers, or the best tasting cabbage plants, or the cats with the curliest ears, or the prettiest goldfish, or the smartest dogs, or the strongest horses, whatever it might be. They pick the individuals that vary in ways that the humans like, encourage those individuals to breed, and discourage the others from breeding. And by the way, this is something we know from historical accounts that Native Americans were doing. They already knew how to do this at the time that Europeans came. The Chinese had worked it out. It's not, it's the kind of thing that people just learn if they're observing their environment carefully and depending on it for food. This is just the kind of thing that, jumps out at you if you take the time to observe any wild or domesticated population. So in artificial selection, you have human breeders determining which individuals breed and which ones don't. In natural selection, humans are not directly involved. Humans are not deliberately deciding who breeds and who doesn't. It's more like the total environment decides, if you can call it decision, who breeds and who doesn't. Some individuals vary in ways that give them better odds of reproducing in the environment where they live, and those will leave more offspring that will be like themselves. Repeat this long enough and you can end up with new species. And I'll show you some cases of this in action. This will probably be the last thing we'll hit. Every state has reported super lice. That's a head louse. You might have known people that had this in schools. It's the kind of thing that tends to spread very quickly in elementary schools. And the usual treatment is to wash your hair with a shampoo containing chemicals called pyrethroids. Every state has reported finding lice that are resistant to pyrethroids. How does this happen? Lice vary in their susceptibility to pyrethroids. If you have a bunch of lice on your head and you shampoo with pyrethroids, maybe it'll kill most of the lice, but maybe a few of those lice will be slightly better able to resist. They've got some kind of thing that their metabolisms do that makes them a little bit better able to resist pyrethroids. Those are the lice that might survive. And once you stop shampooing, they'll start laying eggs and they'll start making babies that are more like themselves. And then as those lice spread from head to head, you end up with varieties of pyrethroid-resistant lice. We've seen this happening in the mining industry. Mining tends to leave these huge piles of crushed rock that are often contaminated with things like heavy metals. And I'm not talking about Judas Priest and Slayer. I'm talking about mercury, cadmium, lead, things like that that are really, bad for plants. And yet, in the past 150 years, we have varieties of grasses that can grow on these piles of crushed rock rubble that's rich in heavy metals. Why? Grass seeds are always drifting in, maybe on wind or something like that. So this pile of rubble got grass seeds scattered on it, and the vast majority of them died. But a couple, all it would take would be a few that just happen to have something about their metabolism, something about their chemistry that makes them more resistant to heavy metals than other grasses. Those are the ones that will survive. Those are the ones that'll have offspring. And most of those offspring may grow very badly, but maybe there'll be a couple of offspring that are a little bit better at shrugging off heavy metals than their parents were. Repeat this for a long time, and you end up with varieties of grass growing in this heavy metal contaminated soil. And it only has taken 150 years for this to happen. That's not actually that long. We've seen this over even shorter time scales in looking at insects evolving resistance to pesticides. In the 1950s, people used to spray this pesticide called DDT everywhere. DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. I actually know that. And in the 50s, DDT was wonderful. It would kill over 95% of all your mosquitoes. Here's the problem. What happens to the 1% of mosquitoes that don't get killed? Mosquitoes vary in how well they can resist DDT, and the vast majority might be killed, but there'll be a couple, maybe just a few, that just happen by some quirk to have metabolisms that are just a bit better than everybody else's at resisting DDT. So those mosquitoes will survive, and those mosquitoes are going to make babies. And the next generation is going to be more DDT resistant than its parents were. So I think this is data from a population in India. We went from DDT killing over 95% of the mosquitoes to, in a year, DDT was killing about half the mosquitoes, to within less than a year and a half, DDT was killing about 20% of the mosquitoes. Now, that's not artificial selection, because humans were not deliberately trying to breed DDT-resistant mosquitoes. That's exactly what we don't want. Humans did not intentionally breed heavy metal-resistant plants. So it's not artificial selection. Nobody was trying to have this happen. It just does. The same thing is happening with superweeds. I was just reading something about this, an article that came out in the New York Times about a month ago, is that farmers are seeing varieties of weed that can resist every herbicide that they throw on there. And that's starting to become a threat to agricultural yields. Nobody wanted superweeds. Nobody wanted, there's one called, I think it's Parker Amaranth. Nobody wanted Parker Amaranth that could grow so aggressively in your soybean field that it cuts down your soybean production in half. Nobody wants that, but we've created them accidentally. You spray pesticide on a field full of weeds, 99.9% of the weeds die, but maybe there's one of them that's just a little bit more resistant to Roundup or whatever you're spraying. And that one is going to survive long enough to make some seeds and have some babies. So the next time you have to do this, you've got a whole population of plants that are resistant. So maybe you spray with a little more herbicide and you kill most of them, but maybe there'll be just one that happens to make it through. Repeat over many generations, and you've got monster pigweed that is resistant to just about everything you can use. This is happening now. It's the reason why we're seeing antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and it's the same logic. You take a dose of antibiotics, you kill 99.99% of the deadly bacteria. But if there's one survivor that just happens to be able to make like Taylor Swift and shake it off, shake it off, shake it off. There's me singing a song for a female voice. The bacteria gonna play, 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 and the antibiotics hate, 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 hate. Some of your bacteria shake, 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 shake it off, shake it off. Ooh, ooh. Right. Anyway, dignity, what's that? You've got disease-causing bacteria. You take a dose of antibiotics, it might kill 99.99%, but especially if you don't take the full course of antibiotics and you leave a few survivors, a few of those will just happen to be resistant, and they can grow back, and you'll get an infection that's now resistant to the antibiotic that you hit it with. Things like MRSA appeared that way. Nobody wanted MRSA. MRSA's methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Sound like a cross-dresser, good grief. Some people have no appreciation for art. Yeah, you end up with populations of bacteria that can now resist anything we can throw at them. So this is clearly a challenge, and kind of a downer note to end this lecture on, but I'm going to stop now because it's 10:40, and that's the way that natural selection works. And we will pick this up on Thursday and see if we can carry this idea farther. So, by the power vested in me by the state of Arkansas, I will now stop the recording.